Chapter 13, Part 1. Annie Besant, by Annie Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Socialism. The rest of 1883 passed in the usual way of hard work. The Affirmation Bill was rejected, and the agitation for constitutional right grew steadily. The liberal press was won over, and Mr. Bradlaugh was beginning to earn golden opinions on all sides for his courage, his tenacity, and his self-control. A successful international congress at Amsterdam took some of us over to the northern Venice, where a most successful gathering was held. To me personally, the year has a special interest as being the one in which my attention was called, though only partially, to the Socialist movement. I had heard Louise Michel lecture in the early spring. A brief controversy in the National Reformer had interested me, but I had not yet concerned myself with the economic basis of socialism. I had realized that the land should be public property, but had not gone into the deeper economic causes of poverty, though the question was pressing with ever-increasing force on heart and brain. Of socialist teaching I knew nothing, having studied only the older English economists in my younger days. In 1884, a more definite call to consider these teachings was to come, and I may perhaps open the record of 1884 with the words of greeting spoken by me to our readers in the first number of the Reformer for that year. What tests 1884 may have for our courage, what strains on our endurance, what trials of our loyalty, none can tell. But this we know, that every test of courage successfully met, every strain of endurance steadily borne, every trial of loyalty nobly surmounted, leaves courage braver, endurance stronger, loyalty truer than each was before. And therefore, for our own and for the world's sake, I will not wish you, friends, an 1884 in which there shall be no toil and no battling, but I will wish you, each and all, the hero's heart and the hero's patience, in the struggle for the world's raising, that will endure through the coming year. On February 3rd, I came for the first time across a paper called Justice, in which Mr. Bradlaugh was attacked, and which gave an account of a meeting of the Democratic Federation, not yet the Social Democratic, in which a man had, apparently unrebuked, said that all means were justifiable to attain working-class ends. I protested strongly against the advocacy of criminal means, declaring that those who urged the use of such means were the worst foes of social progress. A few weeks later, the Echo repeated a speech of Mr. Hyndman's in which a bloodier revolution than that of France was prophesied, and the extinction of book learning seemed coupled with the success of socialism, and this again I commented on. But I had the pleasure a week later of reprinting from Justice a sensible paragraph condemning the advocacy of violence so long as free agitation was allowed. The spring was marked by two events on which I have not time or space to dwell: the resignation by Mr. Bradlaugh of his seat, on the reiteration of the resolution of exclusion, and his triumphant return for the fourth time by an increased majority, a vote of 4,032, a higher poll than that of the general election, and the release of Mr. Foote on February 25th from Holloway, whence he was escorted by a procession a quarter of a mile in length. On the 12th of March he and his fellow prisoners received a magnificent reception and were presented with valuable testimonials at the Hall of Science. Taking up again the thread of socialism, the great debate in St. James's Hall, London, between Mr. Bradlaugh and Mr. Hyndman on April 17th, roused me to a serious study of the questions raised. Socialism has in England no more devoted, no more self-sacrificing advocate than Henry Hyndman, a man of wide and deep reading, wielding most ably a singularly fascinating pen, with talents that would have made him wealthy in any career he adopted. He has sacrificed himself without a murmur to the people's cause. He has borne obloquy from without, suspicion and unkindness from those he served, and surrounded by temptations to betray the people, he has never swerved from his integrity. He has said rash things, has been stirred to passionate outbursts and reckless phrases. But love to the people and sympathy with suffering lay at the root of his wildest words, and they count but little as against his faithful service. Personally, my debt to him is of a mixed character. He kept me from socialism for some time by his bitter and very unjust antagonism to Mr. Bradlaugh, but it was the debate at St. James's Hall that, while I angrily resented his injustice, made me feel that there was something more in practical socialism than I had imagined, especially when I read it over afterwards, away from the magic of Mr. Bradlaugh's commanding eloquence and personal magnetism. It was a sore pity that English Socialists, from the outset of their movement, treated Mr. Bradlaugh so unfairly, so that his friends were set against Socialists ere they began to examine their arguments. I must confess that my deep attachment to him led me into injustice to his Socialist foes in those early days, and often made me ascribe to them calculated malignity instead of hasty and prejudiced assertion. Added to this, their uncurbed violence in discussion, their constant interruptions during the speeches of opponents, their reckless inaccuracy in matters of fact, were all bars standing in the way of the thoughtful. When I came to know them better, I found that the bulk of their speakers were very young men, overworked and underpaid, who spent their scanty leisure in efforts to learn, to educate themselves, to train themselves, and I learned to pardon faults which grew out of the bitter sense of injustice, and which were due largely to the terrible pressure of our system on characters not yet strong enough (how few are strong enough) to bear grinding injustice without loss of balance and of impartiality. None save those who have worked with them know how much of real nobility, of heroic self-sacrifice, of constant self-denial, of brotherly affection there is among the Social Democrats. At this time also I met George Bernard Shaw, one of the most brilliant of Socialist writers and most provoking of men, a man with a perfect genius for aggravating the enthusiastically earnest, and with a passion for representing himself as a scoundrel. On my first experience of him on the platform at South Place Institute, he described himself as a loafer, and I gave an angry snarl at him in the Reformer, for a loafer was my detestation, and behold, I found that he was very poor, because he was a writer with principles and preferred starving his body to starving his conscience, that he gave time and earnest work to the spreading of Socialism, spending night after night in workmen's clubs, and that a loafer was only an amiable way of describing himself because he did not carry a hod. Of course I had to apologize for my sharp criticism as doing him a serious injustice, but privately felt somewhat injured at having been entrapped into such a blunder. Meanwhile I was more and more turning aside from politics and devoting myself to the social condition of the people. I find myself in June protesting against Sir John Lubbock's bill which fixed a 12-hour day as the limit of a young person's toil. A day of 12 hours is brutal, I wrote. If the law fixes 12 hours as a fair day, that law will largely govern custom. I declare that a legal day should be 8 hours on 5 days in the week, and not more than 5 hours on the 6th. If the labour is of an exhausting character, these hours are too long. On every side now the Socialist controversy grew, and I listened, read, and thought much, but said little. The inclusion of John Robertson in the staff of the Reformer brought a highly intellectual Socialist into closer touch with us, and slowly I found that the case for Socialism was intellectually complete and ethically beautiful. The trend of my thought was shown by urging the feeding of board school children, breaking down under the combination of education and starvation, and I asked why should people be pauperized by a rate-supported meal and not pauperized by state-supported police, drainage, road mending, street lighting, etc. Socialism in its splendid ideal appealed to my heart, while the economic soundness of its basis convinced my head. All my life was turned towards the progress of the people, the helping of man, and it leaped forward to meet the stronger hope, the lofty ideal of social brotherhood, the rendering possible to all of freer life. So long had I been striving thitherward, and here there opened up a path to the yearned-for goal. How strong were the feelings surging in my heart may be seen in a brief extract from an article published second week of January, 1885. Christian charity? We know its work. It gives 100 weight of coal and 5 pounds of beef once a year to a family whose head could earn 100 such doles if Christian justice allowed him a fair wage for the work he performs. It plunders the workers of the wealth they make, then flings back at them 1,000th part of their own product as charity. It builds hospitals for the poor whom it has poisoned in filthy courts and alleys, and workhouses for the worn-out creatures from whom it has wrung every energy, every hope, every joy. Miss Cobb summons us to admire Christian civilization, and we see idlers flaunting in the robes woven by the toilers, a glittering tinselled superstructure founded on the tears, the strugglings, the grey, hopeless misery of the poor. The first month of January, 1885, brought on me the first attack from my Socialist tendencies. from the pen of Mr. W.P. Ball, who wrote to the Reformer complaining of my paragraph, quoted above, in which I had advocated rate-supported meals for board school children. A brief controversy thus arose, in which I supported my opinion, waiving the question as to my being at heart a socialist. In truth, I dreaded to make the plunge of publicly allying myself with the advocates of socialism, because of the attitude of bitter hostility they had adopted toward Mr. Bradlaugh. On his strong, tenacious nature, nurtured on self-reliant individualism, the arguments of the younger generation made no impression. He could not change his methods because a new tendency was rising to the surface, and he did not see how different was the socialism of our day to the socialist dreams of the past. Noble ideals of a future not immediately realizable in truth, but to be worked towards and rendered possible in the days to come. Could I take public action which might bring me into collision with the dearest of my friends, which might strain the strong and tender tie so long existing between us? My affection, my gratitude, all warred against the idea of working with those who wronged him so bitterly. But the cry of starving children was ever in my ears, the sobs of women poisoned in lead works, exhausted in nail works, driven to prostitution by starvation, made old and haggard by ceaseless work. I saw their misery was the result of an evil system, was inseparable from the private ownership of the instruments of wealth production, that while the worker was himself but an instrument, selling his labour under the law of supply and demand, he must remain helpless in the grip of the employing classes, and that trade combinations could only mean increased warfare, necessary indeed for the time as weapons of defence, but meaning war, not brotherly cooperation of all for the good of all. A conflict which was stripped of all covering, a conflict between a personal tie and a call of duty, could not last long, and with a heavy heart I made up my mind to profess socialism openly and work for it with all my energy. Happily, Mr. Bradlaugh was as tolerant as he was strong, and our private friendship remained unbroken, but he never again felt the same confidence in my judgment as he felt before, nor did he any more consult me on his own policy, as he had done ever since we first clasped hands. A series of articles in Our Corner on the redistribution of political power, on the evolution of society, on modern socialism, made my position clear. Over against those who laud the present state of society, with its unjustly rich and its unjustly poor, with its palaces and its slums, its millionaires and its paupers, be it ours to proclaim that there is a higher ideal in life than that of being first in the race for wealth, most successful in the scramble for gold. Be it ours to declare steadfastly that health, comfort, leisure, culture, plenty for every individual are far more desirable than the breathless struggle for existence, furious trampling down of the weak by the strong, huge fortunes accumulated out of the toil of others, to be handed down to those who had done nothing to earn them. Be it ours to maintain that the greatness of a nation depends not on the number of its great proprietors, on the wealth of its great capitalists, or on the splendour of its great nobles, but on the absence of poverty among its people, on the education and refinement of its masses, on the universality of enjoyment in life, enough for each of work, of leisure, of joy, too little for none, too much for none. Such is the social ideal. Better to strive after it worthily and fail than to die without striving for it at all. Then I differentiated the methods of the socialist and the radical individualist, pleading for union among those who formed the wings of the army of labour, and urging union of all workers against the idlers. For the weakness of the people has ever been in their divisions, in the readiness of each section to turn its weapons against other sections instead of against the common foe. All privileged classes, when they are attacked, sink their differences and present a serried front to their assailants. The people alone fight with each other, while the battle between themselves and the privileged is raging. I strove, as so many others were striving, to sound in the ears of the thoughtless and the careless the cry of the sufferings of the poor, endeavouring to make articulate their misery. Thus, in a description of Edinburgh slums came the following: I saw in a house which was made by boarding up part of a passage which had no window, and in which it was necessary to burn an oil lamp all day, thus adding to the burden of the rent, a family of 3, man, wife, and child, whose lot was hardly of their own making. The man was tall and bronzed, but he was dying of heart disease. He could not do hard work. He was too clumsy for light work. So he sat there, after 2 days' fruitless search, patiently nursing his miserable, scrofulous baby in his dim and narrow den. The cases of individual hopeless suffering are heartbreaking. In one room lay a dying child, dying of a low fever brought on by want of food. "It hae no faither," sobbed the mother, and for a moment I did not catch the meaning that the father had left to the mother all the burden of a child unallowed by law. In another, the corpse of a mother, with the children round her, and hard-featured, gentle-hearted women came in to take back to their overcrowded beds the mitherless bairns. In yet another, a woman, shrunken and yellow, crouching over a glimmer of fire. "I am dying of cancer of the womb," she said, and with that pathetic resignation to the inevitable so common among the poor. I sat chatting for a few minutes. "Come again, dearie," she said as I rose to go. "It's gey dull sitting here the day through." The article in which these, among other descriptions, occurred was closed with the following: "Passing out of the slums into the streets of the town, only a few steps separating the horror and the beauty, I felt, with a vividness more intense than ever, the fearful contrasts between the lots of men, and with more pressing urgency the question seemed to ring in my ears, Is there no remedy? Must there always be rich and poor? Some say that it must be so, that the palace and the slum will forever exist as the light and the shadow. Not so do I believe. I believe that the poverty is the result of ignorance and of bad social arrangements, and that therefore it may be eradicated by knowledge and by social change. I admit that for many of these adult dwellers in the slums there is no hope, poor victims of a civilization that hides its brutality beneath a veneer of culture and of grace. For them individually there is, alas, no salvation, but for their children, yes. Healthy surroundings, good food, mental and physical training, plenty of play, and carefully chosen work, these might save the young and prepare them for happy life. But they are being left to grow up as their parents were, and even when a few hours of school are given them, the home half neutralizes what the education effects. The scanty aid given is generally begrudged. The education is to be but elementary. As little as possible is doled out. Yet these children have each one of them hopes and fears, possibilities of virtue and of crime, a life to be made or marred. We shower money on generals and on nobles. We keep high-born paupers living on the national charity. We squander wealth with both hands on army and navy, on churches and palaces. But we grudge every halfpenny that increases the education rate, and howl down every proposal to build decent houses for the poor. We cover our heartlessness and indifference with fine phrases about sapping the independence of the poor and destroying their self-respect. With loathsome hypocrisy we repair a prince's palace for him, and let him live in it rent-free, without one word about the degradation involved in his thus living upon charity, while we refuse to pauperize the toiler by erecting decent buildings in which he may live, not rent-free like the prince, but only paying a rent which shall cover the cost of erection and maintenance, instead of one which gives a yearly profit to the speculator. And so, year after year, the misery grows, and every great city has on its womb a cancer, sapping its vitality, poisoning its life-blood. Every great city is breeding in its slums a race which is reverting through the savage to the brute, a brute more dangerous in that degraded humanity has possibilities of evil in it beyond the reach of the mere wild beast. If not for love's sake, then for fear. If not for justice or for human pity, then for sheer desire of self-preservation. I appeal to the wise and to the wealthy to set their hands to the cure of social evil, ere stolidity gives place to passion and dull patience vanishes before fury, and they learn at last, in some wild hour, how much the wretched dare. Because it was less hotly antagonistic to the radicals than the two other socialist organizations, I joined the Fabian Society, and worked hard with it as a speaker and lecturer. Sidney Webb, G. Bernard Shaw, Hubert and Mrs. Bland, Graham Wallas, these were some of those who gave time, thought, incessant work to the popularizing of socialist thought, the spreading of sound economics, the effort to turn the workers' energy towards social rather than merely political reform. We lectured at workmen's clubs wherever we could gain a hearing, till we leavened London radicalism with socialist thought, and by treating the radical as the unevolved socialist rather than as the anti-socialist, we gradually won him over to socialist views. We circulated questions to be put to all candidates for parliamentary or other offices, stirred up interest in local elections, educated men and women into an understanding of the causes of their poverty, won recruits for the army of propagandists from the younger of the educated middle class. That the London working classes today are so largely socialist is greatly due to the years of work done among them by members of the Fabian Society, as well to the splendid, if occasionally too militant, energy of the Social Democratic Federation, and to the devotion of that noble and generous genius, William Morris. During this same year, 1885, a movement was set on foot in England to draw attention to the terrible sufferings of the Russian political prisoners, and it was decided at a meeting held in my house to form a Society of the Friends of Russia, which should seek to spread accurate and careful information about the present condition of Russia. At that meeting were present Charles Bradlaugh, Stepniak, and many others, ERPs acting as honorary secretary. It is noteworthy that some of the most prominent Russian exiles, such as Kropotkin, take the view that the Tsar himself is not allowed to know what occurs, and is very largely the victim of the bureaucracy that surrounds him. Another matter that increased as the months went on was the attempt of the police authorities to stop socialist speaking in the open air. Christians, freethinkers, Salvationists, agitators of all kinds were for the most part left alone, but there was a regular crusade against the socialists. Liberal and Tory journals alike condemned the way in which, in Dodd Street in September, the Socialists' meetings were attacked. Quiet persistence was shown by the promoters, members of the Social Democratic Federation, and they were well supported by other Socialists and by the Radical clubs. I volunteered to speak on October 4th, my first Sunday in London, after the summoning and imprisoning of the speakers had commenced. But the attitude of the people was so determined on the preceding Sunday that all interference was withdrawn. Herbert Burrows stood for the school board for the Tower Hamlets in November of this year, and I find a paragraph in the Reformer in which I heartily wished him success, especially as the first candidate who had put forward a demand for industrial education. In this, as in so many practical proposals, Socialists have led the way. He polled 4,232 votes, despite the furious opposition of the clergy to him as a freethinker, of the publicans to him as a teetotaler, of the maintainers of the present social system to him as a socialist. And his fight did much to make possible my own success in 1888. With this autumn, too, began, in connection with the struggle for the right of meeting, the helping of the workmen to fair trial by providing of bail and legal defence. The first case that I bailed out was that of Lewis Lyons, sent to jail for 2 months with hard labour by Mr. Saunders of the Thames Police Court. Oh, the weary, sickening waiting in the court for my prisoner, the sordid vice, the revolting details of human depravity to which my unwilling eyes and ears were witnesses. I carried Lyons off in triumph, and the Middlesex magistrates quashed the conviction, the evidence being pronounced by them to be confusing, contradictory, and worthless. Yet but for the chance of one of us stepping forward to offer bail and to provide the means for an appeal, I acted on Mr. Bradlaugh's suggestion and advice, for he acted as counsellor to me all through the weary struggles that lasted until 1888, putting his great legal knowledge at my disposal, though he often disapproved my action, thinking me quixotic. But for this, Lewis Lyons would have had to suffer his heavy sentence. The general election took place this autumn, and Northampton returned Mr. Bradlaugh for the 5th time, thus putting an end to the long struggle, for he took the oath in his seat in the following January and at once gave notice of an oaths bill to give to all who claimed it, under all circumstances, the right to affirm. He was returned with the largest vote ever polled for him, 4,315, and he entered Parliament with all the prestige of his great struggle, and went to the front at once, one of the recognised forces in the House. The action of Mr. Speaker Peel promptly put an end to an attempted obstruction. Sir Michael Hicks Beach, Mr. Cecil Raikes, and Sir John Hennaway had written to the Speaker asking his interference, but the Speaker declared that he had no authority, no right to stand between a duly elected member and the duty of taking the oath prescribed by statute. Thus ended the constitutional struggle of 6 years, that left the victor well nigh bankrupt in health and in purse, and sent him to a comparatively early grave. He lived long enough to justify his election, to prove his value to the House and to his country, but he did not live long enough to render to England all the services which his long training, his wide knowledge, his courage, and his honesty so eminently fitted him to yield. Our Corner now served as a valuable aid in Socialist propaganda, and its monthly Socialist Notes became a record of Socialist progress in all lands. We were busy during the spring in organizing a conference for the discussion of the present commercial system and the better utilization of national wealth for the benefit of the community. And this was successfully held at South Place Institute on June 9th, 10th, and 11th, the 3 days being given respectively to the utilization of land, the utilization of capital, and the democratic policy. On the 9th, Mr. Bradlaugh spoke on the utilization of waste lands, arguing that in a thickly populated country no one had the right to keep cultivable land uncultivated, and that where land was so kept there should be compulsory expropriation, the state taking the land and letting it out to cultivating tenants. Among the other speakers were Edward Carpenter, William Morris, Sidney Webb, John Robertson, William Sanders, W. Donisthorpe, Edward Aveling, Charlotte Wilson, Mrs. Fenwick Miller, Hubert Bland, Dr. Pankhurst, and myself. Men and women of many views met to compare methods, and so help on the cause of social regeneration. End of Chapter 13, Part 1. Chapter 13, Part 2. Annie Besant, by Annie Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bitter attacks were made on me for my socialist advocacy by some of the radicals in the Free Thought Party, and looking back I find myself condemned as a Saint Athanasius in petticoats, and as possessing a mind like a milk jug. This same courteous critic remarked, "I have heard Mrs. Besant described as being, like most women, at the mercy of her last male acquaintance for her views on economics." I was foolish enough to break a lance in self-defence with this assailant, not having then learned that self-defence was a waste of time that might be better employed in doing work for others. I certainly should not now take the trouble to write such a paragraph as the following. The moment a man uses a woman's sex to discredit her arguments, the thoughtful reader knows that he is unable to answer the arguments themselves. But really these silly sneers at women's ability have lost their force, and are best met with a laugh at the stupendous male self-conceit of the writer. I may add that such shafts are specially pointless against myself. A woman who thought her way out of Christianity and Whiggism into free thought and radicalism, absolutely alone, who gave up every old friend, male and female, rather than resign the beliefs she had struggled to in solitude, who again in embracing active socialism has run counter to the views of her nearest male friends. Such a woman may very likely go wrong, but I think she may venture, without conceit, to at least claim independence of judgment. I did not make the acquaintance of one of my present socialist comrades, male or female, until I had embraced socialism. A foolish paragraph, as are all self-defences, and a mischievous one, as all retort breeds fresh strife. But not yet had come the self-control that estimates the judgments of others at their true value, that recks not of praise and blame, nor yet had I learned that evil should not be met with evil, wrath with wrath, nor yet were the words of the Buddha the law to which I strove to render obedience. Hatred ceases not by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. The year 1886 was a terrible one for labour. Everywhere reductions of wages, everywhere increase of the numbers of the unemployed. Turning over the pages of Our Corner, I see socialist notes filled, month after month, with a monotonous tale. There is a reduction of wages at such and such a place. So many men have been discharged at blank, owing to the slackness of trade. Our hearts sank lower and lower as summer passed into autumn. The coming winter threatened to add to starvation the bitter pains of cold. The agitation for the 8 hours' day increased in strength as the unemployed grew more and more numerous week by week. "We can't stand it," a sturdy, quiet fellow had said to me during the preceding winter. "Flesh and blood can't stand it, and 2 months of this bitter cold, too." "We may as well starve idle as starve working," had said another, with a fierce laugh. And a spirit of sullen discontent was spreading everywhere, discontent that was wholly justified by facts. But how patient they were for the most part, how sadly, pathetically patient, this crucified Christ, humanity. Wrongs that would set my heart and my tongue afire would be accepted as a matter of course. O blind and mighty people, how my heart went out to you, trampled on, abused, derided, asking so little and needing so much, so pathetically grateful for the pettiest services, so loving and so loyal to those who offered you but their poor services and helpless love. Deeper and deeper into my innermost nature ate the growing desire to succor, to suffer for, to save. I had long given up my social reputation. I now gave up with ever-increasing surrender, ease, comfort, time. The passion of pity grew stronger and stronger, fed by each new sacrifice, and each sacrifice led me nearer and nearer to the threshold of that gateway beyond which stretched a path of renunciation I had never dreamed of, which those might tread who were ready wholly to strip off self for man's sake, who for love's sake would surrender love's return from those they served, and would go out into the darkness for themselves, that they might, with their own souls as fuel, feed the light of the world. As the suffering deepened with the darkening months, the meetings of the unemployed grew in number, and the murmurs of discontent became louder. The Social Democratic Federation carried on an outdoor agitation, not without making blunders, being composed of human beings, but with abundant courage and self-sacrifice. The policy of breaking up socialist meetings went on while other meetings were winked at, and John Williams, a fiery speaker, but a man with a record of pathetic struggle and patient heroism, was imprisoned for 2 months for speaking in the open air, and so nearly starved in jail that he came out with his health broken for life. 1887 dawned, the year that was to close so stormily, and socialists everywhere were busying themselves on behalf of the unemployed, urging vestries to provide remunerative work for those applying for relief, assailing the local government board with practicable proposals for utilizing the productive energies of the unemployed, circulating suggestions to municipalities and other local representative bodies, urging remedial measures. A 4 days oral debate with Mr. Foote and a written debate with Mr. Bradlaugh occupied some of my energies, and helped in the process of education to which public opinion was being subjected. Both these debates were largely circulated as pamphlets. A series of afternoon debates between representative speakers was organized at South Place Institute, and Mr. Corey Grant and myself had a lively discussion, I affirming that the existence of classes who live upon unearned incomes is detrimental to the welfare of the community, and ought to be put an end to by legislation. Another debate, in this very quarrelsome spring of 1887, was a written one in the National Reformer, between the Reverend G. F. Handel Rowe and myself, on the proposition, is atheism logically tenable, and is there a satisfactory atheistic system for the guidance of human conduct? And so the months went on, and the menace of misery grew louder and louder, till in September I find myself writing, "This one thing is clear, society must deal with the unemployed, or the unemployed will deal with society. Stormier and stormier becomes the social outlook, and they at least are not the worst enemies of society who seek to find some way through the breakers by which the ship of the Commonwealth may pass into quiet waters." Some amusement turned up in the shape of a Charing Cross Parliament in which we debated with much vigour the burning questions of the day. We organised a compact socialist party, defeated a Liberal government, took the reins of office, and, after a Queen's speech in which Her Majesty addressed her loyal Commons with a plainness of speech never before or since heard from the throne, we brought in several bills of a decidedly heroic character. G. Bernard Shaw, as President of the Local Government Board, and I, as Home Secretary, came in for a good deal of criticism in connection with various drastic measures. An International Free Thought Congress held in London entailed fairly heavy work, and the science classes were ever with us. Another written debate came with October, this time on the teachings of Christianity, making the 5th of these set discussions held by me during the year. The same month brought a change, painful but just. I resigned my much prized position as co-editor of the National Reformer, and the number for October 23rd bore Charles Bradlaugh's name alone. The change did not affect my work on the paper, but I merely became a subordinate, though remaining, of course, joint proprietor. The reason cannot be more accurately given than in the paragraph penned at the time. For a considerable time past, and lately in increasing numbers, Complaints have reached me from various quarters of the inconvenience and uncertainty that result from the divided editorial policy of this paper on the question of Socialism. Some months ago I proposed to avoid this difficulty by resigning my share in the editorship, but my colleagues, with characteristic liberality, asked me to let the proposal stand over and see if matters would not adjust themselves. But the difficulty, instead of disappearing, has only become more pressing, and we both feel that our readers have a right to demand that it be solved. When I became co-editor of this paper, I was not a socialist, and although I regard socialism as the necessary and logical outcome of the radicalism which for so many years the National Reformer has taught, still, as in avowing myself a socialist I have taken a distinct step. The partial separation of my policy in labour questions from that of my colleague has been of my own making, and not of his, and it is therefore for me to go away. Over by far the greatest part of our sphere of action we are still substantially agreed, and are likely to remain so. But since, as socialism becomes more and more a question of practical politics, differences of theory tend to produce differences in conduct, and since a political paper must have a single editorial program in practical politics, it would obviously be most inconvenient for me to retain my position as co-editor. Therefore I resume my former position as contributor only, thus clearing the National Reformer of all responsibility for the views I hold. To this Mr. Bradlaugh added the following: I need hardly add to this how very deeply I regret the necessity for Mrs. Besant's resignation of the joint editorship of this journal, and the real grief I feel in accepting this break in a position in which she has rendered such enormous service to the free thought and radical cause. As a most valued contributor, I trust the National Reformer may never lose the efficient aid of her brain and pen. For 13 years this paper has been richer for good by the measure of her never-ceasing and most useful work. I agree with her that a journal must have a distinct editorial policy, and I think this distinctness the more necessary when, as in the present case, every contributor has the greatest freedom of expression. I recognize in the fullest degree the spirit of self-sacrifice in which the lines, to which I add these words, have been penned by Mrs. Besant. Charles Bradlaugh. It was a wrench, this breaking of a tie for which a heavy price had been paid 13 years before, but it was just. Any one who makes a change with which pain is connected is bound, in honour and duty, to take that pain as much as possible on himself. He must not put his sacrifice on others, nor pay his own ransom with their coin. There must be honour kept in the life that reaches towards the ideal, for broken faith to that is the only real infidelity. And there was another reason for the change that I dared not name to him, for his quick loyalty would then have made him stubbornly determined against change. I saw the swift turning of public opinion, the gradual approach to him among liberals who had hitherto held aloof, and I knew that they looked upon me as a clog and a burden, and that were I less prominently with him, his way would be the easier to tread. So I slipped more and more into the background, no longer went with him to his meetings. My use to him in public was over, for I had become a hindrance instead of help. While he was outcast and hated, I had the pride of standing at his side. When all the fair-weather friends came buzzing round him, I served him best by self-effacement, and I never loved him better than when I stood aside. But I continued all the literary work unaltered, and no change of opinions touched his kindness to me, although when, a little later, I joined the Theosophical Society, he lost his trust in my reasoning powers and judgment. In this same month of October the unemployed began walking in procession through the streets, and harshness on the part of the police led to some rioting. Sir Charles Warren thought it his duty to dragoon London meetings after the fashion of continental prefects, with the inevitable result that an ill feeling grew up between the people and the police. At last we formed a Socialist Defence Association, in order to help poor workmen brought up and sentenced on police evidence only, without any chance of being given them of proper legal defence, and I organized a band of well-to-do men and women who promised to obey a telegraphic summons night or day, and to bail out any prisoner arrested for exercising the ancient right of walking in procession and speaking. To take one instance, Mr. Burleigh, the well-known war correspondent, and Mr. Winks were arrested and run in with Mr. J. Knight, a workman, for seditious language. I went down to the police station to offer bail for the latter. Chief Constable Howard accepted bail for Messrs. Burleigh and Winks, but refused it for Mr. Knight. The next day at the police court, the preposterous bail of £400 was demanded for Mr. Knight, and supplied by my faithful band, and on the next hearing Mr. Poland, Solicitor to the Treasury, withdrew the charge against him for lack of evidence. Then came the closing of Trafalgar Square, and the unexpected and high-handed order that cost some men their lives, many their liberty, and hundreds the most serious injuries. The Metropolitan Radical Federation had called a meeting for November 13th to protest against the imprisonment of Mr. O'Brien, and as Mr. Matthews, from his place in the House, had stated that there was no intention of interfering with bona fide political meetings, the Radical clubs did not expect police interference. On November 9th, Sir Charles Warren had issued an order forbidding all meetings in the square, but the clubs trusted the promise of the Home Secretary. On Saturday evening only, November 12th, when all arrangements were completed, did he issue a peremptory order forbidding processions within a certain area. With this trap suddenly sprung upon them, the delegates from the clubs, the Fabian Society, the Social Democratic Federation, and the Socialist League met on that same Saturday evening to see to any details that had been possibly left unsettled. It was finally decided to go to the square as arranged, and, if challenged by the police, to protest formally against the illegal interference, then to break up the processions and leave the members to find their own way to the square. It was also decided to go Sunday after Sunday to the square until the right of public meetings was vindicated. The procession I was in started from Clerkenwell Green, and walked with its banner in front, and the chosen speakers, including myself, immediately behind the flag. As we were moving slowly and quietly along one of the narrow streets debouching on Trafalgar Square, wondering whether we would be challenged, there was a sudden charge, and without a word the police were upon us with uplifted truncheons. The banner was struck down, and men and women were falling under a hail of blows. There was no attempt at resistance. The people were too much astounded at the unprepared attack. They scattered, leaving some of their number on the ground too much injured to move, and then made their way in twos and threes to the square. It was garrisoned by police, drawn up in serried rows, that could only have been broken by a deliberate charge. Our orders were to attempt no violence, and we attempted none. Mr. Cunningham Graham and Mr. John Burns, arm in arm, tried to pass through the police, and were savagely cut about the head and arrested. Then ensued a scene to be remembered. The horse police charged in squadrons at a hand gallop, rolling men and women over like ninepins, while the foot police struck recklessly with their truncheons, cutting a road through the crowd that closed immediately behind them. I got on a wagonette and tried to persuade the driver to pull his trap across one of the roads and to get others in line so as to break the charges of the mounted police. But he was afraid and drove away to the embankment, so I jumped out and went back to the square. At last a rattle of cavalry, and up came the Life Guards, cleverly handled but hurting none, trotting their horses gently and soldiering the crowd apart. And then the Scots Guards, with bayonets fixed, marched through and occupied the north of the square. Then the people retreated as we passed round the word, "Go home, go home." The soldiers were ready to fire, the people unarmed. It would have been but a massacre. Slowly the square emptied, and all was stilled. All other processions were treated as ours had been, and the injuries inflicted were terrible. Peaceable, law-abiding workmen who had never dreamed of rioting were left with broken legs, broken arms, wounds of every description. One man, Linnell, died almost immediately, others from the effect of their injuries. The next day, a regular court-martial in Bow Street Police Court, witnesses kept out by the police, men dazed with their wounds, decent workmen of unblemished character who had never been charged in a police court before, sentenced to imprisonment without a chance of defense. But a gallant band rallied to their rescue. William T. Stead, most chivalrous of journalists, opened a defense fund, and money rained in. My pledged bail came up by the dozen, and we got the men out on appeal. By sheer audacity I got into the police court, addressed the magistrate, too astounded by my profound courtesy and calm assurance to remember that I had no right there, and then produced bail after bail of the most undeniable character and respectability, which no magistrate could refuse. Breathing time gained, a barrister, Mr. W. M. Thompson, worked day after day with hearty devotion and took up the legal defense. Fines we paid, and here Mrs. Marks Aveling did eager service. A pretty regiment I led out of Millbank Prison after paying their fines. Bruised, clothes torn, hatless, we must have looked a disreputable lot. we stopped and bought hats to throw an air of respectability over our cortege, and we kept together until I saw the men into train and omnibus, lest, with the bitter feelings now aroused, conflict should again arise. We formed the Law and Liberty League to defend all unjustly assailed by the police, and thus rescued many a man from prison. We gave poor Linnell, killed in Trafalgar Square, a public funeral. Sir Charles Warren forbade the passing of the hearse through any of the main thoroughfares west of Waterloo Bridge, so the processions waited there for it. W.T. Stead, R. Cunningham Graham, Herbert Burrows, and myself walked on one side of the coffin, William Morris, F. Smith, R. Dowling, and J. Seddon on the other. The Reverend Stuart D. Headlam, the officiating clergyman, walked in front. 50 stewards, carrying long wands, guarded the coffin. From Wellington Street to Bow Cemetery the road was one mass of human beings, who uncovered reverently as the slain man went by. At Aldgate the procession took 3/4 of an hour to pass one spot, and thus we bore Linnell to his grave, symbol of a cruel wrong, the vast, orderly, silent crowd, bareheaded, making mute protest against the outrage wrought. It is pleasant to put on record here Mr. Bradlaugh's grave approval of the heavy work done in the police courts, and the following paragraph shows how generously he could praise one not acting on his own lines. As I have on most serious matters of principle recently differed very widely from my brave and loyal co-worker, and as the difference has been regrettably emphasized by her resignation of her editorial functions on this journal, it is the more necessary that I should say how thoroughly I approve, and how grateful I am to her for her conduct in not only obtaining bail and providing legal assistance for the helpless unfortunates in the hands of the police, but also for her daily personal attendance and wise conduct at the police stations and police courts, where she has done so much to abate harsh treatment on the one hand and rash folly on the other. While I should not have marked out this as fitting woman's work, especially in the recent very inclement weather, I desire to record my view that it has been bravely done, well done, and most usefully done, and I wish to mark this the more emphatically as my views and those of Mrs. Besant seem wider apart than I could have deemed possible on many of the points of principle underlying what is every day growing into a most serious struggle. Ever did I find Charles Bradlaugh thus tolerant of differences of opinion, generously eager to approve what to him seemed right, even in a policy he disapproved. The indignation grew and grew. The police were silently boycotted, but the people were so persistent and so tactful that no excuse for violence was given, until the strain on the police force began to tell, and the Tory government felt that London was being hopelessly alienated. So at last Sir Charles Warren fell, and a wiser hand was put at the helm. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, Part 1, Annie Besant, by Annie Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Through storm to peace. Out of all this turmoil and stress rose a brotherhood that had in it the promise of a fairer day. Mr. Stead and I had become close friends, he Christian, I atheist, burning with one common love for man, one common hatred against oppression. And so in Our Corner, for February 1888, I wrote, "Lately there has been dawning on the minds of men far apart in questions of theology the idea of founding a new brotherhood, in which service of man should take the place erstwhile given to service of God. A brotherhood in which work should be worship and love should be baptism, in which none should be regarded as alien who was willing to work for human good." One day as I was walking towards Millbank Jail with the Reverend S.D. Headlam on the way to liberate a prisoner, I said to him, "Mr. Headlam, we ought to have a new church, which should include all who have the common ground of faith in and love for man." And a little later I found that my friend Mr. W.T. Stead, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette, had long been brooding over a similar thought, and wondering whether men might not be persuaded to be as earnest about making this world happy as they are over saving their souls. The teaching of social duty, the upholding of social righteousness, the building up of a true commonwealth, such would be among the aims of the Church of the future. Is the hope too fair for realization? Is the winning of such beatific vision yet once more the dream of the enthusiast? But surely the one fact that persons so deeply differing in theological creeds as those who have been toiling for the last 3 months to aid and relieve the oppressed, can work in absolute harmony side by side for the one end. Surely this proves that there is a bond which is stronger than our antagonisms, a unity which is deeper than the speculative theories which divide. How unconsciously I was marching towards the Theosophy which was to become the glory of my life, groping blindly in the darkness for that very brotherhood, definitely formulated on these very lines by those elder brothers of our race, at whose feet I was soon to throw myself. How deeply this longing for something loftier than I had yet found had wrought itself into my life, how strong the conviction was growing that there was something to be sought to which the service of man was the road, may be seen in the following passage from the same article. It has been thought that in these days of factories and of tramways, of shoddy, of adulteration, that all life must tread with even rhythm of measured footsteps, and that the glory of the ideal could no longer glow over the greyness of a modern horizon. But signs are not awanting that the breath of the older heroism is beginning to stir men's breasts, and that the passion for justice and for liberty, which thrilled through the veins of the world's greatest in the past, and woke our pulses to responsive throb, has not yet died wholly out of the hearts of men. Still the quest of the Holy Grail exercises its deathless fascination, but the seekers no longer raise eyes to heaven, nor search over land and sea, for they know that it waits them in the suffering at their doors, that the consecration of the holiest is on the agonizing masses of the poor and the despairing. The cup is crimson with the blood of the people, the grey-grown, speechless Christ. If there be a faith that can remove the mountains of ignorance and evil, it is surely that faith in the ultimate triumph of right, in the final enthronement of justice, which alone makes life worth the living, and which gems the blackest cloud of depression with the rainbow-coloured arch of an immortal hope. As a step towards bringing about some such union of those ready to work for man, Mr. Stead and I projected The Link, a halfpenny weekly, the spirit of which was described in its motto, taken from Victor Hugo. The people are silence. I will be the advocate of this silence. I will speak for the dumb. I will speak for the small to the great, and of the feeble to the strong. I will speak for all the despairing silent ones. I will interpret this stammering. I will interpret the grumblings, the murmurs, the tumults of crowds, the complaints ill-pronounced, and all these cries of beasts that, through ignorance and through suffering, man is forced to utter. I will be the word of the people. I will be the bleeding mouth whence the gag is snatched out. I will say everything. It announced its object to be the building up of a new church dedicated to the service of man, and what we want to do is to establish in every village and in every street some man or woman who will sacrifice time and labor as systematically and as cheerfully in the temporal service of man as others do in what they believe to be the service of God. Week after week we issued our little paper, and it became a real light in the darkness. There the petty injustices inflicted on the poor found voice. There the starvation wages paid to women found exposure. There sweating was brought to public notice. A finisher of boots paid 2 shillings 6 per dozen pairs, and find your own polish and thread. Women working for 10.5 hours per day making shirts, fancy best, at from 10 pence to 3 shillings per dozen, finding their own cotton and needles, paying for gas, towel, and tea, compulsory, earning from 4 shillings to 10 shillings per week for the most part. A mantle finisher, 2 shillings 2 pence a week, out of which 6 pence for materials. Respectable, hard-working woman tried for attempted suicide, driven to rid herself of life from want. Another part of our work was defending people from unjust landlords, exposing workhouse scandals, enforcing the Employers' Liability Act, Charles Bradlaugh's Truck Act, forming vigilance circles whose members kept watch in their own district over cases of cruelty to children, extortion, insanitary workshops, sweating, etc., reporting each case to me. Into this work came Herbert Burrows, who had joined hands with me over the Trafalgar Square defence, and who wrote some noble articles in The Link. A man loving the people with passionate devotion, hating oppression and injustice with equal passion, working himself with remorseless energy, breaking his heart over wrongs he could not remedy. His whole character once came out in a sentence when he was lying delirious and thought himself dying. "Tell the people how I have loved them always." In our crusade for the poor, we worked for the dockers. "Tomorrow morning, in London alone, 20,000 to 25,000 adult men," wrote Sidney Webb, "will fight like savages for permission to labour in the docks for 4d. an hour, and 1/3 of them will fight in vain and be turned workless away." We worked for children's dinners. If we insist on these children being educated, is it not necessary that they shall be fed? If not, we waste on them knowledge they cannot assimilate, and torture many of them to death. Poor waifs of humanity, we drive them into the school and bid them learn, and the pitiful, wistful eyes question us why we inflict this strange new suffering, and bring into their dim lives this new pang. "Why not leave us alone?" ask the pathetically patient little faces. Why not, indeed, since for these child martyrs of the slums, society has only formulas, not food. We cried out against cheap goods. That meant sweated and therefore stolen goods. The ethics of buying should surely be simply enough. We want a particular thing, and we do not desire to obtain it either by begging or by robbery. But if in becoming possessed of it we neither beg it nor steal, we must give for it something equivalent in exchange. So much of our neighbour's labour has been put into the thing we desire. If we will not yield him fair equivalent for that labour, yet take his article, we defraud him, and if we are not willing to give that fair equivalent, we have no right to become the owners of his product. This branch of our work led to a big fight, a fight most happy in its results. At a meeting of the Fabian Society, Miss Clementina Black gave a capital lecture on female labour, and urged the formation of a consumers' league, pledged only to buy from shops certified clean from unfair wage. H. Champion, in the discussion that followed, drew attention to the wages paid by Bryant and May, Limited, while paying an enormous dividend to their shareholders, so that the value of the original £5 shares was quoted at £18 7s. 6d. Herbert Burrows and I interviewed some of the girls, got lists of wages, of fines, etc. A typical case is that of a girl of 16, a piece worker. She earns 4 shillings a week, and lives with a sister, employed by the same firm, who earns good money, as much as 8 shillings or 9 shillings a week. Out of the earnings, 2 shillings a week is paid for the rent of one room. The child lives only on bread and butter and tea, alike for breakfast and dinner, but related with dancing eyes that once a month she went to a meal where you get coffee and bread and butter, and jam and marmalade, and lots of it. We published the facts under the title of White Slavery in London, and called for a boycott of Bryant and May's matches. "It is time someone came and helped us," said 2 pale-faced girls to me, and I asked, "Who will help? Plenty of people wish well to any good cause, but very few care to exert themselves to help it, and still fewer will risk anything in its support." "Someone ought to do it, but why should I?" is the ever re-echoed phrase of weak-kneed amiability. "Someone ought to do it, so why not I?" is the cry of some earnest servant of man, eagerly forward-springing to face some perilous duty. Between those 2 sentences lie whole centuries of moral evolution. I was promptly threatened with an action for libel, but nothing came of it. It was easier to strike at the girls, and a few days later Fleet Street was enlivened by the eruption of a crowd of match girls demanding Annie Besant. I couldn't speechify to match girls in Fleet Street, so asked that a deputation should come and explain what they wanted. Up came 3 women and told their story. They had been asked to sign a paper certifying that they were well treated and contented, and that my statements were untrue. They refused. "You had spoke up for us," explained one, "and we weren't going back on you." A girl, pitched on as their leader, was threatened with dismissal. She stood firm. Next day she was discharged for some trifle, and they all threw down their work, some 1,400 of them, and then a crowd of them started off to me to ask what to do next. If we ever worked in our lives, Herbert Burrows and I worked for the next fortnight, and a pretty hubbub we created. We asked for money, and it came pouring in. We registered the girls to receive strike pay, wrote articles, roused the clubs, held public meetings, got Mr. Bradlaugh to ask questions in Parliament, stirred up constituencies in which shareholders were members, till the whole country rang with the struggle. Mr. Frederick Cheriton lent us a hall for registration. Mr. Sidney Webb and others moved the National Liberal Club to action. We led a procession of the girls to the House of Commons, and interviewed with a deputation of them members of Parliament who cross-questioned them. The girls behaved splendidly, stuck together, kept brave and bright all through. Mr. Hobart of the Social Democratic Federation, Messrs. Shaw, Bland, and Oliver, and Headlam of the Fabian Society, Miss Clementina Black, and many another, helped in the heavy work. The London Trades Council finally consented to act as arbitrators, and a satisfactory settlement was arrived at. The girls went into work, fines and deductions were abolished, better wages paid, the Matchmakers' Union was established, still the strongest women's trades union in England, and for years I acted as secretary, till under press of other duties I resigned, and my work was given by the girls to Mrs. Thornton Smith. Herbert Burrows became, and still is, the treasurer. For a time there was friction between the company and the union, but it gradually disappeared under the influence of common sense on both sides, and we have found the manager ready to consider any just grievance and to endeavour to remove it, while the company have been liberal supporters of the Working Women's Club at Bow, founded by H.P. Blavatsky. The worst suffering of all was among the box makers, thrown out of work by the strike, and they were hard to reach. 2 farthing per gross of boxes and buy your own string and paste is not wealth, but when the work went, more rapid starvation came. Oh, those trudges through the lanes and alleys around Bethnal Green Junction late at night, when our day's work was over. Children lying about on shavings, rags, anything. Famine looking out of baby faces, out of women's eyes, out of the tremulous hands of men. Heart grew sick and eyes dim, and ever louder the question, where is the cure for sorrow? What is the way of rescue for the world? In August I asked for a match girls' drawing room. It will want a piano, tables for papers, for games, for light literature, so that it may offer a bright, home-like refuge to these girls, who now have no real homes, no playground save the streets. It is not proposed to build an institution with stern and rigid discipline and enforcement of prim behaviour, but to open a home filled with a genial atmosphere of cordial comradeship and self-respecting freedom. The atmosphere so familiar to all who have grown up in the blessed shelter of a happy home, so strange, alas, to too many of our East London girls. In the same month of August, 2 years later, H.P. Blavatsky opened such a home. Then came a cry for help from South London, from tin box makers, illegally fined and in many cases grievously mutilated by the non-fencing of machinery. Then aid to shop assistants, also illegally fined. Legal defences by the score still continued. A vigorous agitation for a free meal for children and for fair wages to be paid by all public bodies. Work for the dockers and exposure to their wrongs. A visit to the Cradley Health chain makers, speeches to them, writing for them, a contest for the school board for the Tower Hamlets division, and a triumphant return at the head of the poll. Such were some of the ways in which the autumn days were spent, to say nothing of scores of lectures, secularist, labour, socialist, and scores of articles written for the winning of daily bread. When the school board work was added, I felt that I had as much work as one woman's strength could do. Thus was ushered in 1889, the to me never-to-be-forgotten year in which I found my way home, and had the priceless good fortune of meeting and of becoming the pupil of H.P. Blavatsky. Ever more and more had been growing on me the feeling that something more than I had was needed for the cure of social ills. The socialist position sufficed on the economic side, but where to gain the inspiration, the motive, which should lead to the realization of the brotherhood of man? Our efforts to really organize bands of unselfish workers had failed. Much, indeed, had been done, but there was not a real movement of self-sacrificing devotion, in which men worked for love's sake only, and asked but to give, not to take. Where was the material for the nobler social order? Where the hewn stones for the building of the temple of man? A great despair would oppress me as I sought for such a movement, and found it not. Not only so, but since 1886 there had been slowly growing up a conviction that my philosophy was not sufficient, that life and mind were other than, more than, I had dreamed. Psychology was advancing with rapid strides. Hypnotic experiments were revealing unlooked-for complexities in human consciousness, strange riddles of multiplex personalities, and, most startling of all, vivid intensities of mental action when the brain, that should be the generator of thought, was reduced to a comatose state. Fact after fact came hurtling in upon me, demanding explanation I was incompetent to give. I studied the obscurer sides of consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, illusions, insanity. Into the darkness shot a ray of light. H.P. Sinnett's Occult World, with its wonderfully suggestive letters, expounding not the supernatural, but a nature under law, wider than I had dared to conceive. I added spiritualism to my studies, experimenting privately, finding the phenomena indubitable, but the spiritualistic explanation of them incredible. The phenomena of clairvoyance, clairaudience, thought-reading were found to be real. Under all the rush of the outer life already sketched, these questions were working in my mind. Their answers were being diligently sought. I read a variety of books, but could find little in them that satisfied me. I experimented in various ways suggested in them, and got some, to me, curious results. I finally convinced myself that there was some hidden thing, some hidden power, and resolved to seek until I found, and by the early spring of 1889 I had grown desperately determined to find at all hazards what I sought. At last, sitting alone in deep thought as I had become accustomed to do after the sun had set, filled with an intense but nearly hopeless longing to solve the riddle of life and mind, I heard a voice that was later to become to me the holiest sound on earth, bidding me take courage, for the light was near. A fortnight passed, and then Mr. Stead gave into my hands 2 large volumes. "Can you review these? My young men all fight shy of them, but you are quite mad enough on these subjects to make something of them." I took the books. They were the 2 volumes of The Secret Doctrine, written by H.P. Blavatsky. Home I carried my burden, and sat me down to read. As I turned over page after page, the interest became absorbing, but how familiar it seemed! How my mind leapt forward to presage the conclusions! How natural it was, how coherent, how subtle, and yet how intelligible! I was dazzled, blinded by the light in which disjointed facts were seen as parts of a mighty whole, and all my puzzles, riddles, problems seemed to disappear. The effect was partially illusory in one sense, in that they all had to be slowly unravelled later, the brain gradually assimilating that which the swift intuition had grasped as truth. But the light had been seen, and in that flash of illumination I knew that the weary search was over and the very truth was found. I wrote the review and asked Mr. Stead for an introduction to the writer, and then sent a note asking to be allowed to call. I received the most cordial of notes, bidding me come, and in the soft spring evening Herbert Burrows and I, for his aspirations were as mine on this matter, walked from Netting Hill Station, wondering what we should meet, to the door of 17 Lansdowne Road. A pause, a swift passing through hall and outer room, through folding doors thrown back, a figure in a large chair before a table, a voice vibrant, compelling. "My dear Mrs. Besant, I have so long wished to see you," and I was standing with my hand in her firm grip, and looking for the first time in this life straight into the eyes of H.P.B. I was conscious of a sudden leaping forth of my heart. Was it recognition? And then I am ashamed to say, a fierce rebellion, a fierce withdrawal, as of some wild animal when it feels a mastering hand. I sat down, after some introductions that conveyed no ideas to me, and listened. She talked of travels of various countries, easy, brilliant talk, her eyes veiled, her exquisitely moulded fingers rolling cigarettes incessantly. Nothing special to record, no word of occultism, nothing mysterious, a woman of the world chatting with her evening visitors. We rose to go, and for a moment the veil lifted, and 2 brilliant, piercing eyes met mine, and with a yearning throb in the voice, "Oh, my dear Mrs. Besant, if you would only come among us!" I felt a well-nigh uncontrollable desire to bend down and kiss her, under the compulsion of that yearning voice, those compelling eyes, but with a flash of the old unbending pride and an inward jeer at my own folly, I said a commonplace polite good-bye, and turned away with some inanely courteous and evasive remark. "Child," she said to me long afterwards, "your pride is terrible. You are as proud as Lucifer himself." But truly I think I never showed it to her again after that first evening, though it sprang up wrathfully in her defence many and many a time, until I learned the pettiness and the worthlessness of all criticism, and knew that the blind were objects of compassion, not of scorn. Once again I went, and asked about the Theosophical Society, wishful to join, but fighting against it. For I saw, distinct and clear, with painful distinctness indeed, what that joining would mean. I had largely conquered public prejudice against me by my work on the London School Board, and a smoother road stretched before me, whereon effort to help should be praised, not blamed. Was I to plunge into a new vortex of strife, and make myself a mark for ridicule, worse than hatred, and fight again the weary fight for an unpopular truth? Must I turn against materialism, and face the shame of publicly confessing that I had been wrong, misled by intellect, to ignore the soul? Must I leave the army that had battled for me so bravely, the friends who through all brutality of social ostracism had held me dear and true? And he, the strongest and truest friend of all, whose confidence I had shaken by my socialism, must he suffer the pang of seeing his co-worker, his co-fighter, of whom he had been so proud, to whom he had been so generous, go over to the opposing hosts and leave the ranks of materialism? What would be the look in Charles Bradlaugh's eyes when I told him that I had become a Theosophist? The struggle was sharp and keen, but with none of the anguish of old days in it, for the soldier had now fought many fights and was hardened by many wounds. And so it came to pass that I went again to Lansdowne Road to ask about the Theosophical Society. H.P. Blavatsky looked at me piercingly for a moment. "Have you read the report about me of the Society for Psychical Research?" "No, I have never heard of it, so far as I know." "Go and read it, and if, after reading it, you come back, well—" And nothing more would she say on the subject, but branched off to her experience in many lands. I borrowed a copy of the report, read and reread it. Quickly I saw how slender was the foundation on which the imposing structure was built, the continual assumptions on which conclusions were based, the incredible character of the allegations, and, most damning fact of all, the foul source from which the evidence was derived. Everything turned on the veracity of the Coulombs, and they were self-stamped as partners in the alleged frauds. Could I put such against the frank, fearless nature that I had caught a glimpse of, against the proud, fiery truthfulness that shone at me from the clear blue eyes, honest and fearless as those of a noble child? Was the writer of the secret doctrine this miserable impostor, this accomplice of tricksters, this foul and loathsome deceiver, this conjurer with trap-doors and sliding panels? I laughed aloud at the absurdity, and flung the report aside with the righteous scorn of an honest nature that knew its own kin when it met them, and shrank from the foulness and baseness of a lie. The next day saw me at the Theosophical Publishing Company's office at 7 Duke Street, Adelphi, where Countess Wachtmeister, one of the lealest of H.P.B.'s friends, was at work, and I signed an application to be admitted as Fellow of the Theosophical Society. On receiving my diploma, I betook myself to Lansdowne Road, where I found H.P.B. alone. I went over to her, bent down and kissed her, but said no word. "You have joined the society?" "Yes." "You have read the report?" "Yes." "Well?" I knelt down before her and clasped her hands in mine, looking straight into her eyes. "My answer is, will you accept me as your pupil, and give me the honour of proclaiming you my teacher in the face of the world?" Her stern, set face softened, the unwonted gleam of tears sprang to her eyes. Then, with a dignity more than regal, she placed her hand upon my head. "You are a noble woman. May Master bless you." From that day, the 10th of May, 1889, until now, 2 years 3½ months after she left her body on May 8th, 1891, my faith in her has never wavered, my trust in her has never been shaken. I gave her my faith on an imperious intuition. I proved her true day after day in closest intimacy living by her side, and I speak of her with the reverence due from a pupil to a teacher who never failed her, with the passionate gratitude which, in our school, is the natural meed of the one who opens the gateway and points out the path. Folly, fanaticism, scoffs the Englishman of the 19th century. Be it so. I have seen, and I can wait. I have been told that I plunged headlong into Theosophy and let my enthusiasm carry me away. I think the charge is true, insofar as the decision was swiftly taken. But it had long been led up to, and realized the dreams of childhood on the higher planes of intellectual womanhood. And let me here say that more than all I hoped for in that first plunge has been realized, and a certainty of knowledge has been gained on doctrines seen as true as that swift flash of illumination. I know, by personal experiment, that the soul exists, and that my soul, not my body, is myself, that it can leave the body at will, that it can, disembodied, reach and learn from living human teachers, and bring back and impress on the physical brain that which it has learned, that this process of transferring consciousness from one range of being, as it were, to another, is a very slow process, during which the body and brain are gradually correlated with the subtler form which is essentially that of the soul, and that my own experience of it, still so imperfect, so fragmentary, when compared with the experience of the highly trained, is like the first struggles of a child learning to speak compared with the perfect oratory of the practiced speaker. That consciousness, so far from being dependent on the brain, is more active when freed from the gross forms of matter than when encased within them. That the great sages spoken of by H.P. Blavatsky exist, that they wield powers and possess knowledge before which our control of nature and knowledge of her ways is but as child's play. All this and much more have I learned, and I am but a pupil of low grade, as it were in the infant class of the occult school, so the first plunge has been successful, and the intuition has been justified. This same path of knowledge that I am treading is open to all others who will pay the toll demanded at the gateway, and that toll is willingness to renounce everything for the sake of spiritual truth, and willingness to give all the truth that is won to the service of man, keeping back no shred for self. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Chapter 14, Part 2. Annie Besant, by Annie Besant. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On June 23rd, in a review of the secret doctrine in the National Reformer, the following passages occur and show how swiftly some of the main points of the teaching had been grasped. There is a blunder in the statement that of the 7 modifications of matter science knows only 4, and till lately knew only 3. These 4 are sub-states only, subdivisions of the lowest plane. After saying that the 19th century Englishman would be but too likely to be repelled if he only skimmed the book, I went on, "With telescope and with microscope, with scalpel and with battery, Western science interrogates nature, adding fact to fact, storing experience after experience, but coming ever to gulfs unfathomable by its plummets, to heights unscalable by its ladders. Wide and masterful in its answers to the how, the why ever eludes it, and causes remain enwrapped in gloom. Eastern science uses as its scientific instrument the penetrating faculties of the mind alone, and regarding the material plane as Maya, illusion, seeks in the mental and spiritual planes of being the causes of the material effects. There too is the only reality, there the true existence of which the visible universe is but the shadow. It is clear from such investigations some further mental equipment is necessary than that normally afforded by the human body. And here comes the parting of the ways between East and West. For the study of the material universe, our 5 senses, aided by the instruments invented by science, may suffice. For all we can hear and see, taste and handle, these accustomed servitors, though often blundering, are the best available guides to knowledge. But it lies in the nature of the case that they are useless when the investigation is to be into modes of existence which cannot impress themselves on our nerve ends. For instance, what we know as colour is the vibration frequency of etheric waves striking on the retina of the eye, between certain definite limits. 759 trillions of blows from the maximum, 436 trillions from the minimum. These waves give rise in us to the sensation which the brain translates into colour. Why the 436 trillion blows at one end of a nerve become red at the other end we do not know. We chronicle the fact but cannot explain it. But our capacity to respond to the vibration cannot limit the vibrational capacity of the ether. To us, the higher and lower rates of vibration do not exist, but if our senses of vision were more sensitive, we should see where now we are blind. Following this line of thought, we realize that matter may exist in forms unknown to us, in modifications to which our senses are unable to respond. Now steps in the Eastern sage and says, "That which you say may be, is. We have developed and cultivated senses as much superior to yours as your eye is superior to that of the jellyfish. We have evolved mental and spiritual faculties which enable us to investigate on the higher planes of being with as much certainty as you are investigating on the physical plane. There is nothing supernatural in the business, any more than your knowledge is supernatural, though much above that accessible to the fish. We do not speculate on these higher forms of existence. We know them by personal study, just as you know the fauna and flora of your world. The powers we possess are not supernatural. They are latent in every human being, and will be evolved as the race progresses. All that we have done is to evolve them more rapidly than our neighbours, by a procedure as open to you as it was to us. Matter is everywhere, but it exists in 7 modifications of which you only know 4, and until lately only knew 3. In those higher forms reside the causes of which you see the effects in the lower, and to know these causes you must develop the capacity to take cognizance of the higher planes." Then followed a brief outline of the cycle of evolution, and I went on, "What part does man play in this vast drama of a universe? Needless to say, he is not the only living form in a cosmos, which for the most part is uninhabitable by him. As science has shown living forms everywhere on the material plane, races in each drop of water, life throbbing in every leaf and blade, so the secret doctrine points to living forms on higher planes of existence, each suited to its environment, till all space thrills with life, and nowhere is there death, but only change. Amid these myriads are some evolving towards humanity, some evolving away from humanity as we know it, divesting themselves of its grosser parts. For man is regarded as a 7-fold being, 4 of these parts belonging to the animal body and perishing at or soon after death, while 3 form his higher self, his true individuality, and these persist and are immortal. These form the ego, and it is this which passes through many incarnations, learning life's lesson as it goes, working out its own redemption within the limits of an inexorable law, sowing seeds of which it ever reaps the harvest, building its own fate with tireless fingers, and finding nowhere in the measureless time and space around it any that can lift for it one weight it has created, one burden it has gathered, unravel for it one tangle it has twisted, close for it one gulf it has digged." Then, after noting the approaches of Western science to Eastern, came the final words. It is of curious interest to note how some of the latest theories seem to catch glimpses of the occult doctrines, as though science were standing on the very threshold of knowledge which shall make all her past seem small. Already her hand is trembling towards the grasp of forces beside which all those now at her command are insignificant. How soon will her grip fasten on them? Let us hope not until social order has been transformed, lest they should only give more to those who have, and leave the wretched still wretcheder by force of contrast. Knowledge used by selfishness widens the gulf that divides man from man and race from race, and we may well shrink from the idea of new powers in nature being yoked to the car of greed. Hence, the wisdom of those masters in whose name Madame Blavatsky speaks has ever denied the knowledge which is power until love's lesson has been learned, and has given only into the hands of the selfless the control of those natural forces which, misused, would wreck society. This review and the public announcement demanded by honesty that I had joined the Theosophical Society naturally raised somewhat of a storm of criticism, and the National Reformer of June 30th contained the following. The review of Madame Blavatsky's book in the last National Reformer, and an announcement in the Star, have brought me several letters on the subject of Theosophy. I am asked for an explanation as to what Theosophy is, and as to my own opinion on Theosophy. The word Theosoph is old, and was used among the Neoplatonists. From the dictionary its new meaning appears to be one who claims to have a knowledge of God or of the laws of nature by means of internal illumination. An atheist certainly cannot be a theosophist. A deist might be a theosophist. A monist cannot be a theosophist. Theosophy must at least involve dualism. Modern theosophy, according to Madame Blavatsky, as set out in last week's issue, asserts much that I do not believe, and alleges some things that to me are certainly not true. I have not had the opportunity of reading Madame Blavatsky's 2 volumes, but I have read during the past 10 years many publications from the pen of herself, Colonel Olcott, and of other theosophists. They appear to me to have sought to rehabilitate a kind of spiritualism in Eastern phraseology. I think many of their allegations utterly erroneous, and their reasonings wholly unsound. I very deeply regret indeed that my colleague and co-worker has, with somewhat of suddenness, and without any interchange of ideas with myself, adopted as facts matters which seem to me to be as unreal as it is possible for any fiction to be. My regret is greater as I know Mrs. Besant's devotion to any course she believes to be true. I know that she will always be earnest in the advocacy of any views she undertakes to defend, and I look to possible developments of her theosophic views with the very gravest misgiving. The editorial policy of this paper is unchanged, and is directly antagonistic to all forms of theosophy. I would have preferred on this subject to have held my peace, for the public disagreeing with Mrs. Besant on her adoption of Socialism has caused pain to both. But on reading her article and taking the public announcement made of her having joined the Theosophical organization, I owe it to those who look to me for guidance to say this with clearness. Charles Bradlaugh. It is not possible for me to state here fully my reasons for joining the Theosophical Society, the 3 objects of which are to found a universal brotherhood without distinction of race or creed, to forward the study of Aryan literature and philosophy, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the physical powers latent in man. On matters of religious opinion, the members are absolutely free. The founders of the society deny a personal God, and a somewhat subtle form of pantheism is taught as the theosophic view of the universe, though even this is not forced on members of the society. I have no desire to hide the fact that this form of pantheism appears to me to promise solution of some problems, especially problems in psychology, which atheism leaves untouched. Annie Besant. Theosophy, as its students well know, so far from involving dualism, is based on the one, which becomes two on manifestation, just as atheism posits one existence only cognizable in the duality force and matter. And as philosophic, though not popular, theism teaches one deity, whereof are spirit and matter. Mr. Bradlaugh's temperate disapproval was not copied in its temperance by some other free-thought leaders, and Mr. Foote especially distinguished himself by the bitterness of his attacks. In the midst of the whirl I was called away to Paris to attend with Herbert Burroughs the great Labour Congress held there from July 15th to July 20th, and spent a day or 2 at Fontainebleau with H.P. Blavatsky, who had gone abroad for a few weeks' rest. There I found her translating the wonderful fragments from the Book of the Golden Precepts, now so widely known under the name The Voice of the Silence. She wrote it swiftly, without any material copy before her, and in the evening made me read it aloud to see if the English was decent. Herbert Burroughs was there, and Mrs. Candler, a staunch American theosophist, and we sat round H.P.B. while I read. The translation was in perfect and beautiful English, flowing and musical. Only a word or 2 could we find to alter, and she looked at us like a startled child, wondering at our praises that anyone with the literary sense would endorse if they read that exquisite prose poem. A little earlier in the same day I had asked her as to the agencies at work in producing the taps so constantly heard at spiritualistic séances. "You don't use spirits to produce taps," she said. "See here." She put her hand over my head, not touching it, and I heard and felt slight taps at the bone of my skull, each sending a little electric thrill down the spine. Then she carefully explained how such taps were producible at any point desired by the operator, and how interplay of the currents to which they were due might be caused otherwise than by conscious human volition. It was in this fashion that she would illustrate her verbal teachings, proving by experiment the statements made as to the existence of subtle forces controllable by the trained mind. The phenomena all belonged to the scientific side of her teaching, and she never committed the folly of claiming authority for her philosophic doctrines on the ground that she was a wonder worker. And constantly she would remind us that there was no such thing as miracle, that all the phenomena she had produced were worked by virtue of a knowledge of nature deeper than that of average people, and by the force of a well-trained mind and will. Some of them were what she would describe as psychological tricks, the creation of images by force of imagination, and impressing them on others as a collective hallucination. Others, such as the moving of solid articles, either by an astral hand projected to draw them towards her, or by using an elemental, others by reading in the astral light, and so on. But the proof of the reality of her mission from those whom she spoke of as masters lay not in these comparatively trivial physical and mental phenomena, but in the splendor of her heroic endurance, the depth of her knowledge, the selflessness of her character, the lofty spirituality of her teaching, the untiring passion of her devotion, the incessant ardor of her work for the enlightening of men. It was these, and not her phenomena, that won for her our faith and confidence, we who lived beside her, knowing her daily life, and we gratefully accepted her teaching not because she claimed any authority, but because it awoke in us powers, the possibility of which in ourselves we had not dreamed of, energies of the soul that demonstrated their own existence. Returning to London from Paris, it became necessary to make a very clear and definite presentment of my change of views, and in the Reformer of August 4th I find the following. Many statements are being made just now about me and my beliefs, some of which are absurdly, and some of which are maliciously, untrue. I must ask my friends not to give credence to them. It would not be fair to my friend Mr. Bradlaugh to ask him to open the columns of this journal to an exposition of Theosophy from my pen, and so bring about a long controversy on a subject which would not interest the majority of the readers of the National Reformer. This being so, I cannot here answer the attacks made on me. I feel, however, that the party with which I have worked for so long has a right to demand of me some explanation of the step I have taken, and I am therefore preparing a pamphlet dealing fully with the question. Further, I have arranged with Mr. R.O. Smith to take as subject of the lectures to be delivered by me at the Hall of Science on August 4th and 11th, Why I Became a Theosophist. Meanwhile, I think that my years of service in the ranks of the Free Thought party give me the right to ask that I should not be condemned unheard, and I even venture to suggest, in view of the praises bestowed on me by freethinkers in the past, that it is possible that there may be something to be said, from the intellectual standpoint, in favour of Theosophy. The caricatures of it which have appeared from some freethinkers' pens represent it about as accurately as the Christian evidence caricatures of atheism represent that dignified philosophy of life. And remembering how much they are themselves misrepresented, I ask them to wait before they judge. The lectures were delivered, and were condensed into a pamphlet bearing the same title, which has had a very great circulation. It closed as follows. There remains a great stumbling block in the minds of many free thinkers, which is certain to prejudice them against Theosophy, and which offers to opponents a cheap subject for sarcasm. The assertion that there exist other living beings than the men and animals found on our own globe. It may be well for people who at once turn away when such an assertion is made, to stop and ask themselves whether they really and seriously believe that throughout this mighty universe, in which our little planet is but as a tiny speck of sand in the Sahara, this one planet only is inhabited by living things? Is all the universe dumb save for our voices, eyeless save for our vision, dead save for our life? Such a preposterous belief was well enough in the days when Christianity regarded our world as the centre of the universe, the human race as the one for which the Creator had deigned to die. But now that we are placed in our proper position, one among countless myriads of worlds, what ground is there for the preposterous conceit which arrogates as ours all sentient existence? Earth, air, water, all are teeming with living beings suited to their environment. Our globe is overflowing with life. But the moment we pass in thought beyond our atmosphere, everything is to be changed. Neither reason nor analogy support such a supposition. It was one of Bruno's crimes that he dared to teach that other worlds than ours were inhabited. But he was wiser than the monks who burned him. All the Theosophists aver is that each phase of matter has living beings suited to it, and that all the universe is pulsing with life. Superstition, shriek the bigoted. It is no more superstitious than the belief in bacteria, or in any other living thing invisible to the ordinary human eye. Spirit is a misleading word, for historically it connotes immateriality and a supernatural kind of existence, and the Theosophist believes neither in the one nor the other. With him all living beings act in and through a material basis, and matter and spirit are not found dissociated. But he alleges that matter exists in states other than those at present known to science. To deny this is to be about as sensible as was the Hindu prince who denied the existence of ice because water, in his experience, never became solid. Refusal to believe until proof is given is a rational position. Denial of all outside our own limited experience is absurd. One last word to my secularist friends. If you say to me, "Leave our ranks," I will leave them. I force myself on no party, and the moment I feel myself unwelcome, I will go. It has cost me pain enough and to spare to admit that the materialism from which I hoped all has failed me, and by such admission to bring on myself the disapproval of some of my nearest friends. But here, as at other times in my life, I dare not purchase peace with a lie. An imperious necessity forces me to speak the truth, as I see it, whether the speech please or displease, whether it bring praise or blame. That one loyalty to truth I must keep stainless, whatever friendships fail me or human ties be broken. She may lead me into the wilderness, yet I must follow her. She may strip me of all love, yet I must pursue her. Though she slay me, yet will I trust in her. And I ask no other epitaph on my tomb, but "She tried to follow truth." Meanwhile, with this new controversy on my hands, the school board work went on, rendered possible, I ought to say, by the generous assistance of friends unknown to me, who sent me £150 a year during the last year and a half. So also went on the vigorous socialist work, and the continual championship of struggling labour movements, prominent here being the organisation of the South London fur pullers into a union, and the aiding of the movement for shortening the hours of tram and bus men, the meetings for which had to be held after midnight. The feeding and clothing of children also occupied much time and attention, for the little ones in my district were, thousands of them, desperately poor. My studies I pursued as best I could, reading in railway carriages, tramcars, omnibuses, and stealing hours for listening to HPB by shortening the nights. In October Mr. Bradlaugh's shaken strength received its death blow, though he was to live yet another 15 months. He collapsed suddenly under a most severe attack of congestion, and lay in imminent peril, devotedly nursed by his only remaining child, Mrs. Bonner, his elder daughter having died the preceding autumn. Slowly he struggled back to life, after 4 weeks in bed, and ordered by his physician to take rest and, if possible, a sea voyage, he sailed for India on November 28th to attend the National Congress, where he was enthusiastically acclaimed as Member for India. In November I argued a libel suit, brought by me against the Reverend Mr. Hoskins, Vicar of Stepney, who had selected some vile passages from a book which was not mine and had circulated them as representing my views during the School Board election of 1888. I had against me the Solicitor General, Sir Edward Clarke at the bar, and Baron Huddleston on the bench. Both counsel and judge did their best to browbeat me and to use the coarsest language, endeavouring to prove that by advocating the limitation of the family I had condemned chastity as a crime. 5 hours of brutal cross-examination left my denial of such teachings unshaken, and even the pleadings of the judge for the clergyman, defending his parishioners against an unbeliever and his laying down as law that the statement was privileged, did not avail to win a verdict. The jury disagreed, not, as one of them told me afterward, on the question of the libel, but on some of the feeling that a clergyman ought not to be mulcted in damages for his overzeal in defence of his faith against the ravening wolf of unbelief, while others, regarding the libel as a very cruel one, would not agree to a verdict that did not carry substantial damages. I did not carry the case to a new trial, feeling that it was not worth while to waste time over it further, my innocence of the charge itself having been fully proved. Busily the months rolled on, and early in the year 1890 H.P. Blavatsky had given to her £1,000 to use in her discretion for human service, and, if she thought well, in the service of women. After a good deal of discussion she fixed on the establishment of a club in East London for working girls, and with her approval Miss Laura Cooper and I hunted for a suitable place. Finally we fixed on a very large and old house, 193 Bow Road, and some months went in its complete renovation and building of a hall attached to it. On August 15th it was opened by Madame Blavatsky and dedicated by her to the brightening of the lot of hard-working and underpaid girls. It has nobly fulfilled its mission for the last 3 years. Very tender was H.P.B.'s heart to human suffering, especially to that of women and children. She was very poor toward the end of her earthly life, having spent all on her mission, and refusing to take time from her Theosophical work to write for the Russian papers which were ready to pay highly for her pen. But her slender purse was swiftly emptied when any human pain that money could relieve came in her way. One day I wrote a letter to a comrade that was shown to her, about some little children to whom I had carried a quantity of country flowers, and I had spoken of their faces pinched with want. The following characteristic note came to me. My dearest friend, I have just read your letter to , and my heart is sick for the poor little ones. Look here, I have but 30 shillings of my own money of which I can dispose, for as you know I am a pauper and proud of it, but I want you to take them and not say a word. This may buy 30 dinners for 30 poor little starving wretches, and I may feel happier for 30 minutes at the thought. Now don't say a word and do it. Take them to those unfortunate babies who loved your flowers and felt happy. Forgive your old uncouth friend, useless in this world. Ever yours, H.P.B. There was this tenderness of hers that led us, after she had gone, to found the H.P.B. Home for Little Children, and one day we hope to fulfill her expressed desire that a large but home-like refuge for outcast children should be opened under the auspices of the Theosophical Society. The lease of 17 Lansdowne Road expiring in the early summer of 1890, it was decided that 19 Avenue Road should be turned into the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in Europe. A hall was built for the meetings of the Blavatsky Lodge, the lodge founded by her, and various alterations made. In July her staff of workers was united under one roof. Thither came Archibald and Bertram Keatley, who had devoted themselves to her service years before, and the Countess Wachtmeister, who had thrown aside all the luxuries of wealth and of high social rank to give all to the cause she served and the friend she loved with deep and faithful loyalty, and George Meade, her secretary and earnest disciple, a man of strong brain and strong character, a fine scholar and untiring worker. Thither too Claude Wright, most lovable of Irishmen, with keen insight underlying a bright and sunny nature, careless on the surface, and Walter Old, dreamy and sensitive, a born psychic, and like many such easily swayed by those around him. Emily Kislingbury also, a studious and earnest woman, Isabel Cooper Oakley, intuitional and studious, a rare combination, and a most devoted pupil in occult studies. James Pryse, an American, than whom none is more devoted, bringing practical knowledge to the help of the work, and making possible the large development of our printing department. These, with myself, were at first the resident staff, Miss Cooper and Herbert Burroughs, who were also identified with the work, being prevented by other obligations from living always as part of the household. The rules of the house were and are very simple, but H.P.B. insisted on great regularity of life. We breakfasted at 8 a.m., worked till lunch at 1, then again till dinner at 7. After dinner the outer work for the society was put aside, and we gathered in H.P.B.'s room, where we would sit talking over plans, receiving instructions, listening to her explanation of knotty points. By 12 midnight all the lights had to be extinguished. My public work took me away for many hours, unfortunately for myself, but such was the regular run of our busy lives. She herself wrote incessantly. Always suffering, but of indomitable will, she drove her body through its tasks, merciless to its weaknesses and its pains. Her pupils she treated very variously, adapting herself with nicest accuracy to their differing natures. As a teacher she was marvellously patient, explaining a thing over and over again in different fashions, until sometimes after prolonged failure she would throw herself back in her chair. "My God," the easy mon Dieu of the foreigner, "am I a fool that you can't understand? Here, so-and-so," to someone on whose countenance a faint gleam of comprehension was discernible, "tell these flapdoodles of the ages what I mean." With vanity, conceit, pretense of knowledge, she was merciless if the pupil were a promising one. Keen shafts of irony would pierce the sham. With some she would get very angry, lashing them out of their lethargy with fiery scorn. And in truth she made herself a mere instrument for the training of her pupils, careless what they or anyone else thought of her, providing that the resulting benefit to them was secured. And we who lived around her, who in closest intimacy watched her day after day, we bear witness to the unselfish beauty of her life, the nobility of her character, and we lay at her feet our most reverent gratitude for knowledge gained, lives purified, strength developed. O noble and heroic soul, whom the outside purblind world misjudges, but whom your pupils partly saw, never through lives and deaths shall we repay the debt of gratitude we owe to you. And thus I came through storm to peace, not to the peace of an untroubled sea of outer life, which no strong soul can crave, but to an inner peace that outer troubles may not avail to ruffle, a peace which belongs to the eternal, not to the transitory, to the depths, not to the shallows of life. It carried me scatheless through the terrible spring of 1891, when death struck down Charles Bradlaugh in the plenitude of his usefulness, and unlocked the gateway into rest for H.P. Blavatsky. Through anxieties and responsibilities heavy and numerous it has borne me. Every strain makes it stronger, every trial makes it serener, every assault leaves it more radiant. Quiet confidence has taken the place of doubt, a strong security the place of anxious dread. In life, through death to life, I am but the servant of the great brotherhood, and those on whose heads but for a moment the touch of the Master has rested in blessing can never again look upon the world save through eyes made luminous with the radiance of the eternal peace. Peace to all beings. End of chapter 14. End of Annie Besant by Annie Besant.